So we're doing a series on the book of Ruth, and today we're about halfway through. Today we pick up on chapter 3. But first I want to just think a little bit about context is important. My grandparents on both sides were farmers. Anyone else have grandparents who were farmers on one or both sides? So there's a lot of background that comes with farms. My dad grew up in Hamler, Ohio, a little church called Hope Lutheran. The biggest event in the life of that church was not Christmas or Easter. It was the Harvest Festival. All right, we talked about a big event where everyone was there. It was a couple-day celebration. And there was all kinds of special offerings which they used to fund missionaries that went all over the world to send. I think they've had 15 sons and daughters of the congregation go on to be pastors. But it all stemmed from the generosity that surrounded the Harvest Festival. Out of the bounty that they had received, they supported ministries all over the place. Now, for the people of Israel as well, the Harvest Festival was a major celebration. It's one of the three big celebrations of the year, Sukkot, or we sometimes call it the Festival of Booths, or the Festival of Tabernacles. It sometimes gets translated in English. Listen to these words from the book of Deuteronomy. You shall keep the Festival of Booths for 7 days, when you've gathered in the produce from your threshing floor and from your winepress. Rejoice during your festival, you and your sons and your daughters and your male and female slaves, as well as the Levites, the strangers, the orphans, and the widows resident in your towns. 7 days you shall keep the festival to the Lord your God at the place the Lord will choose. For the Lord your God will bless you in all your produce and in all your undertakings, and you shall surely celebrate. They called it Festival of Booths because the people during this 7 days would camp outside. They would build temporary shelters or booths to remind them that their ancestors had wandered through the wilderness. They lived in tents. As they left Egypt, they spent these 40 years on their way to the Promised Land, and they had temporary shelters. But during the journey, God provided for their needs along the way. And this was the time for them to go back and remember, even now that they had homes built of stone and had their fields and everything, that God was still the one who provided for their needs. The harvest was not taken for granted. Archaeologists can go back and they can tell that, and even to this day, 1 out of 3 years, you may not get a harvest, or maybe a very small harvest. So when there was a good harvest, this was something worth celebrating. Now, we're not told in the story of Ruth that it was Sukkot that was going on, but we do know that Sukkot, this celebration, happened at the end of the harvest, and we know that the book of Ruth, the setting for the book of Ruth, is the end of the harvest. And we're told that it was a successful harvest season, and that Boaz was celebrating. He was eating, he was drinking, he was sleeping outdoors. This was a time to celebrate God's provision. So for those who maybe weren't here the last couple weeks, let's recap just a little bit book of Ruth. Ruth is a Moabite. She's a foreigner, but ends up in Judah because she had, her mother-in-law was from Judah. She had immigrated because of a famine to Moab, and there she married and had sons. Ruth married one of Naomi's sons. But when Naomi's husband dies and both of her sons die, Ruth makes this pledge, right? She's going to support her mother-in-law, Naomi, and wherever she goes, she's going to go, and she's going to never leave her. And so they return back to the area of Bethlehem, and they're to be sort of dependent on the charity of others for their survival. And one of the ways that happens is that Ruth is sent out to glean in the fields. After the harvesters had gone through, to pick up any little bits that might be left over, to be able to find that for food. Naomi, Ruth's mother-in-law, considered herself cursed, right? She says she's angry at God. She says, you've taken everything away from me. I have nothing left. And she says, don't even call me Naomi anymore, call me Mara, which means bitterness. But as the story progresses, we see a spark of hope that begins. Ruth, in her gleaning, met a relative of Naomi. His name was Boaz. And one day she spent gleaning in Boaz's fields, produced enough grain for them to eat for weeks because of the generosity and Boaz's instructions to leave extra grain for Ruth to be able to pick up. Because Boaz had heard of Ruth's faithfulness to her mother-in-law and her promise never to leave her, to provide for her. So Ruth stays with Boaz throughout the harvest. Thanks to the compassion of Boaz, they would not starve, right? Survival is no longer an imminent threat, but they didn't address the longer-term issue of security. So Naomi develops a plan, not just to have food on the table today, but what's going to happen next month. There was a chance that Boaz might act as what they call the redeemer kinsman. The Hebrew word is goel. The role of the kinsman was to help family members in time of need. Could be any number of things. If someone was wrong, to avenge the wrong, or if someone had a huge debt, to be able to pay the debt for them, or to care for the widow or orphan by marrying them into your family. But how could they encourage Boaz to take on this role with Ruth and Naomi? So Naomi develops a plan. Ruth says to Naomi, my daughter, I need to seek some security for you, so it may be well for you. Here now is our kinsman, Boaz, with whose young women you've been working. See, he's winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Now wash, anoint yourself, put on your best clothes, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he's finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go, uncover his feet, and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. She said to her, all that you tell me, I will do. What? All right. We're dealing with a different culture than ours, all right? We run into trouble when we place our modern Western cultural norms on a very different kind of culture. I get a big kick out of people who talk about following biblical practices of marriage, all right? Because marriage, for the most part, in biblical times, was an arranged contract, much like a transfer of property. It's a patriarchal system where there could be multiple wives and concubines, and that was all part of what marriage looked like. When giving my daughters advice on how to seek a husband, I did not tell them to look their best, watch where a man lies down, uncover him, and ask for instructions, all right? That might be biblical, but no way that was going to happen, all right? So what was this all about? This seems strange to our ears. Well, let's keep reading the story and see what happens here. So Ruth went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had instructed her. When Boaz had eaten and drunk and was in a contented mood, he went to lie down at the end of a heap of grain. Then Ruth came stealthily and uncovered his feet and laid down. At midnight, the man was startled. He turned over, and there lying at his feet was a woman. He said, "Who are you?" She said, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over your servant, for you are next of kin." If it was Naomi's plan to get Boaz's attention, she succeeded. I think she had Boaz's undivided attention. Now, Naomi would not ask Ruth to do something that would risk her reputation or a chance for a future. There was too much at stake for that to happen. But by any standard, this seems to be a very bold move. The middle of the night provided a means for a private conversation, for a proposal that couldn't take place in the light of day because it was not the normal way that things were done. But Ruth doesn't follow Naomi's instructions to do whatever Boaz tells you. Ruth takes the initiative. And Ruth, the first thing she does is propose marriage to Boaz. To spread your cloak over me it's part of the Jewish marriage ritual, all right, to provide security. Ruth doesn't identify Boaz as good boyfriend material. She identifies him as the kinsman redeemer. This is the one who could change our lives. This is the one who could provide security for me, and in so doing also security for Naomi. So Boaz says, "May you be blessed, my daughter. This last instance of your loyalty is better than the first. You've not gone after young men, poor or rich." So what was the first act of loyalty? First act of loyalty was Ruth giving up her future back home to be able to go with Naomi and care for Naomi. The last act of loyalty mentioned was to consider marrying Boaz, not because they were madly in love with each other. I mean, that's not why people got married. This was because this was a way in which Ruth could provide security by reconnecting her with her extended family and a means of support. So what will Boaz do? It's not a matter to be taken lightly. He most likely had other wives and children. There were questions about inheritance, and one's reputation would not be enhanced by marrying a Moabite widow. But Boaz replies. He says, "Now, my daughter, do not be afraid. I will do all that you ask, for all the assembly of the people know that you are a worthy woman. But," I hate it when there's a but, all right? There's always a but what? But what? He says, "Though it's true," we keep on reading, "it's true that I am your near kinsman, there is another kinsman more closely related than I am. Remain the night. In the morning, if he will act as next of kin for you, good. Let him do it. If he's not willing to act as next of kin for you, then as the Lord lives, I will act as next of kin for you. Lie down until morning." So she lay at his feet until morning. They got up before one person could recognize another, for he said it must not be known that a woman came to the threshing floor. So Ruth spends the night. It would not be safe for an unescorted woman to be traveling around at night. But Ruth's actions could be misunderstood, so there was some secrecy involved in this. Ruth leaves with a promise that Boaz will check into the matter, that he will do what is right. If he can find someone else to marry Ruth, wonderful. That would address the needs of her security. But one way or the other, Boaz says, "I will make sure you are cared for." But she's sent home not just with a promise, but with a sign of his intention. It wasn't a ring, anything like that. He says this. He says, "Bring your cloak that you're wearing and hold it out." She held it out, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her back. And then he went to the city. Now, I don't imagine Naomi got a whole lot of sleep that night, wondering where Ruth was. How were things going with Ruth, especially when she was gone all night and then didn't return until the wee hours. So when she comes back, Naomi says, "How did things go, my daughter?" And she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, "He gave me these 6 measures of barley, for he said, 'Do not go to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" She replied, "Wait, my daughter, until you learn how this matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today," which is what we'll hear about next week. All right. Let's get the band back up here. But let me share one more thing here as they're coming up and getting ready here. What Boaz recognizes in Ruth is something, there's a Hebrew word which is called hesed, all right? And the word hesed is translated in different ways. Sometimes we translate it as steadfast love, or loving kindness, or loyalty, or faithfulness, or love that is shown in action. There's no one word that translates it. We usually need a phrase to talk about that. But it's often the word, when Naomi when Ruth shelters Naomi, takes her under her wing, if you will, that is an act of hesed. It's the word that often is used for God to describe God's unfailing love for us, a self-giving love that would do whatever is needed to redeem us. So it's not strange that the title Redeemer is often given also to Jesus, all right? because it's there that we experience steadfast love, loving kindness, love in action, God with us, God for us. Now, spoiler alert for the end of the book here, Boaz does become a redeemer for Ruth and for Naomi. And in some ways, Ruth becomes a redeemer for Boaz. And they have a great grandson who becomes known as King David. Great-grandson, King David. And further down the line is born the one who redeems us all, the one that we know as Jesus.